experiencing an unprecedented level of urgency at the intersection of safety and affordability because of drought and wildfires. Utility investments to mitigate and decrease the risk of wildfires sparked by their equipment, which is a situation in 2021 that's being made even more acute by widespread drought, is placing further costs on utility ratepayers. The CPUC team that you're going to hear from today is engaged in our most important efforts to keep all Californians connected, keep the lights on, keep well-managed water coming out of the faucet, and leave enough money in people's pockets to cover the costs of living in our expensive state. But we can't do this entirely on our own. Some Californians face higher barriers to safe and affordable utility services than others, and it's vital that we hear voices that represent those communities. Only with the full picture of barriers that these communities face and the opportunities they require to advance can we at the CPUC ensure that we are adequately and effectively using our regulatory power on behalf of all Californians. And this is why it's very important that you're here today. This webinar is part of a series to try to make it easier for communities to stay informed about our work, as well as provide us with feedback on programs that we are developing. I very much hope that you'll find today a good use of your time and that you won't hesitate to provide us with direct feedback on how we can do better, either in our programs or in creating more forums like this to hear from local governments and community-based organizations. I'll now hand the floor over to our team to get the program started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We really appreciate you being here for the presentation. Quick note, this webinar is being recorded. If that's an issue, this will be available for private viewing later. And we apologize for any inconvenience. So with that, I'd like to hand the floor over to the first of our experts. Ben, would you like to take it away?
Certainly. Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending this event. My name is Ben Menzies. I'm a public utilities regulatory analyst in the energy division here at the PUC, and I work specifically on our proceedings focusing on disconnections, as well as our proceeding on the COVID-19 debts that customers have experienced. So this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. Today, I'm going to be talking specifically about a pilot program that the PUC has been soliciting comments on for a while and is preparing to issue a proposed decision on that we're eager to receive feedback on and hoping to work with organizations on the ground and the utilities to ensure that it's a real success. Next slide, please. So to give a brief overview of this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the procedural context in the disconnections proceeding, where we are and how we got here, why we're considering a percentage of income-based payment plan, which is the pilot program that I'll be addressing today, the program mechanics, or how it's actually going to work for customers on the ground, some notes about the eligibility for the pilot program and which customers we're hoping to target, as well as some notes about how the pilot will be evaluated and what the pilot is anticipated to lead to. And then finally, I'll wrap up by identifying some opportunities for input where we're hoping to get feedback on what's going to be proposed, and then on an ongoing basis as the pilot is being conducted, where we want to keep hearing from folks on how it's going, again, on the ground. Next slide, please. So to start with the context behind the disconnections proceeding, in 2018, the state legislature passed a bill called Senate Bill 598, which directed the commission to investigate rising disconnections for the large investor-owned utilities. And those are PG&E, Southern California Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Southern California Gas Company, or SoCalGas. And pursuant to this legislation, the PUC opened a proceeding called Rulemaking 18-07-005, or the Disconnections Proceeding, in 2018 to investigate these items. And so this proceeding is looking specifically at those 4 IOUs for the moment, although the handful of small and multi-jurisdictional utilities like Pacific Corp in the far north of the state and Southwest Gas on the sort of southeastern side will be addressed in a future phase of the proceeding that will examine how many of the rules and programs that we've already established for the large IOUs make sense for the smaller utilities. So to go back to the proceeding as it is now, there were 2 phases identified for the proceeding. Phase 1 would provide rapid relief to, the goal of phase 1 rather, was to provide rapid relief to residential customers who are experiencing disconnection and identify and adopt near-term improvements to the current system. The goal of phase 2, after those items had been taken care of, was to take a comprehensive look at disconnections, consider all the systemic costs, socially, economically, risks to health and safety, and ask if there are other better approaches to reduce the disconnection rate or to sort of deal with these issues of customer billing, and basically look at it from a more comprehensive and systemic perspective. So far, 2 decisions have been issued in this proceeding so far. The interim decision, or D12, D18-12013, sorry, I had the wrong number in my notes, which introduced some reporting requirements and some emergency protections for vulnerable customers. And then a phase 1 decision last June of 2020, which included lots of new rules surrounding disconnections. It authorized the new arrearage management plan, debt management programs. And it also identified PIP as a potential solution to disconnections in some cases, but deferred it to consideration in a subsequent PIP phase of this proceeding, which we are now working on. Next slide, please. So why PIP? So first of all, just to say it again, the PIP stands for the Percentage of Income-Based Payment Plans. And it is a pilot program, so it's a bit of a mouthful, but the Percentage of Income-Based Payment Plan pilot program. This is based on programs in other states like Ohio and Illinois that have already established similar programs. And the basic idea is that recurring disconnections are harmful for individual customers and also their communities, and they increase system costs for utilities and ratepayers. Most customers try to pay their bills, try to keep up in some way, seek ways to at least make partial payments, but customers need energy to live their lives, and in some cases that energy demand simply exceeds income on a consistent basis, which makes it very difficult for customers and ad hoc assistance programs to keep up with those bills. So the idea of PIP is to provide affordability and predictability in billing to a targeted group of vulnerable customers that will break the cycle of disconnections. And so specifically, PIP tries to provide affordability because under a PIP program, customer bills are capped at a dollar amount that is based on the customer's income. So there's a direct relationship between the customer's income, their ability to pay, their available resources, and their bill. And then it also creates predictability by imposing a certain amount each month that the customer's bill will not exceed. PIP would allow customers to plan for each month's bill, budget accordingly, and never be caught by surprise billing amounts after an especially hot, cold, or otherwise high usage month. So the intent is to use PIP as a tool to reduce disconnections. And so the pilot will evaluate the effect of it on disconnections. And accordingly, it's intended to be a targeted approach for customers with demonstrated vulnerability to disconnections, particularly in the pilot phase. There have been a couple of avenues for identifying customers. One is on an individual level. We've looked at eligibility for customers who have prior history of disconnection, particularly leading up to the emergency moratorium imposed in March 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And community level as well, because customers in specific geographic areas like zip codes with high disconnection rates also seem like good targets for a program of this kind. And so in both cases, we're specifically targeting customers with lower incomes, such as care customers, but trying to create multiple avenues by which customers might be eligible for PIP. Next slide, please. So to get into the program mechanics of how PIP would actually work, normally a customer would receive their energy bill, which is calculated basically using the price of energy times their usage, and you add in any applicable fees. And then on top of that amount, care customers would receive a discount. But basically the bill is based on the customer's usage. Under PIP, a customer's bill is capped at a fixed amount based on their income. So usually programs identify a specific percentage that is considered to be affordable, such as 2%, 4%, or 6% of income. And one version of how this could work is shown on the right side of this slide. Although I'll note that this figure is from the straw proposal that was circulated a couple of months ago. So final version of the proposal will likely look somewhat different. To walk through this table very briefly to show you how PIP will work, if you look at the second row under reference income used, and you find this refers to the household that is enrolled in PIP, their income. And it's described in terms of FPL, which stands for federal poverty levels. And these are set amounts that are established by the government every year, the federal government every year. So if I'm a household with 50% of federal poverty level income and a household size of 3 or more, my annual household income is estimated to be $10,860, which works out to about $905 a month in monthly income. And so for a 2.5% PIP cap, 2.5% of that monthly income works out to $22. And so if I'm enrolled in PIP and my monthly usage-based bill exceeds $22 a month, I would only be billed the $22 a month. I wouldn't receive my higher bill amount. And so effectively, a customer receives a cap on the amount that they can be charged each month for their bill. As I said, this figure is only provided for illustration purposes. We've received some feedback that this is somewhat complex, both to explain to customers and to administer. And so there's some consideration of trying to simplify it, but this is the basic framework that will likely be used for calculating a customer's bills. In addition, customers with repeated missed bills would be removed from the program. And customers may also enroll in the arrearage management plans I mentioned earlier to receive debt forgiveness at the same time, and as well as other assistance programs like LIHEAP to keep customers current. Next slide, please. So to talk about eligibility a little bit, as I mentioned above, this program is intended to target customers at a high likelihood of being disconnected and offer an alternative that is affordable and predictable. And specifically, we are looking at customers with lower incomes, which are usually identified as care customers for ease. And since its inception, this proceeding has identified community-level impacts of disconnections as a core concern. And so extending eligibility for a program like this to communities with the highest exposure to disconnections was seen as a logical starting point. But we also don't want to exclude customers from eligibility who otherwise should be targeted by this program just because they don't live in the right zip code. And so the final pilot design is attempting to combine a focus on communities and eligibility while also allowing customers at high risk of disconnection, even if they're not in those specific zip codes, to participate. And the way in which the community level eligibility will largely be, utilities will have a fair amount of discretion to identify which communities are their most disconnected communities, whether it's certain zip codes, whether it's the top 20 zip codes, or whether they're identifying those based on the number of disconnections, the rate. And that's just due to the wide variation in service territory characteristics. But essentially, customers who live in high disconnection rate zip codes or who themselves have been disconnected multiple times are anticipated to be eligible for enrollment. And in this pilot, we're targeting maximum enrollment of about 15,000, with each IOU, each utility receiving a specific allocation, based on their relative size. And I should make really clear that I'm talking specifically about items that have been raised in the straw proposal and generally about comments that we've received on that straw proposal. But because the proposed decision is anticipated to mail soon, the final pilot characteristics will likely be different in various ways. Next slide, please. So finally, to talk about evaluation a little bit, the pilot aspect of this program is very important to the Commission. And so the intent is to test the effect of affordability and predictability of billing on customer behavior and susceptibility to disconnection. Some of the program goals that have been identified include reducing disconnections, improving payment behavior, reducing long-term arrearages, both for individuals and communities. And we also want to investigate what happens to customer behavior when bills are capped in this manner. So particularly, what is the effect on customer usage? So that we can minimize risks to other CPUC goals, such as energy conservation. In order to evaluate these results, an independent evaluator will be contracted to monitor that pilot data and report to some sort of working group on a regular basis. And then once enough data is collected by the independent evaluator, they'll report those findings, including whether the program met its goals or should be modified. And if the evaluator finds the program met its goals, the utilities will likely be asked to propose a full-scale version of PIP thereafter. But again, the details of that exact timing are still somewhat undetermined. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, I wanted to just identify some specific areas where we're hoping to get input on this program as it as it's implemented and then later as it's actually ongoing. The most direct way would be to file comments on the proposed decision that I mentioned earlier, which assuming all goes well with the mailing of the proposed decision, we're anticipating those comments would be due by September 27th. As I said, that decision is not out yet, so just keep an eye out on the proceeding webpage for that. And these comments could relate to high-level program design, really anything that you feel needs to be said about the program before it is implemented, the rules, etc. Because once it's approved, it will largely be implemented as approved, although there is opportunity for some modifications as the pilot progresses. The second bullet I have is on program implementation, and this is once the proposed decision is approved by the full commission, the utilities will have to submit advice letters actually describing how they want to implement this program, how to get it off the ground. And there will be opportunities for comment on whether those plans make sense, particularly in the areas of outreach. Are utilities proposing plans that will result in enough customers participating in these programs to get good data on whether or not they work. And so that process will occur after the decision is actually approved by the commission. As I mentioned, this third bullet point, I wanted to flag outreach to customers, because making sure that enough customers are enrolled in this program is a high concern of ours, and we want to make sure that the utilities are able to meet those minimum program goals. And we believe that working closely with community-based organizations and other outreach partners is probably going to be very important for making sure that enough customers are enrolled. And then finally, the ongoing evaluation of this program. As I mentioned, this is a pilot, and so we want to know, is it achieving its goals? But that's going to require us to continually examine the data, ask whether we are asking the right questions of it, and whether we are identifying the right goals. And we're going to rely on feedback from at the ground level as well to tell us whether it's having the intended effect. You know, are customers able to navigate the program rules? Do they understand their new bills? Or is it too complicated, and so customers are not able to keep up with the program? So those are the kinds of questions that we hope to continue to continually revisit throughout the life of the pilot, and we would anticipate looking for feedback as well. Next slide is the question slide. So thank you all for listening to my presentation, and I will answer any questions now.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. John, you've been looking at the chat. Are you seeing? I've seen some people are sending some questions to me privately. Please, if you've got a general question, just put it in the chat, and we can have John or Asia forward it there. I'm trying to manage. We're trying to reduce my mental load on some of these things. John, do you seeing other questions in the open chat?
I just got a couple come in. One is, does this program and discussion cover municipal provided water service?
I can say that for the percentage of income-based payment plan pilot program, municipal water service is not covered. This program is only intended for the energy investor-owned utilities and the large ones right now.
Next question is, how will we decide which CBOs conduct outreach, and will they be compensated?
That's a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't think I can really speak to the details of that at this time because the proposed decision isn't out. I will say that I think that some of those details are still, to be worked out by implementation and the working group and so on.
More questions come in. Why are we proposing federal poverty levels instead of California's higher poverty levels? We find that the federal poverty level is very low in some counties in California.
It's a good question. The reason to use federal poverty levels is largely to harmonize it with other assistance programs like CARE or FARA, which are also based on federal poverty levels. It's a single unified standard for the whole state, which I'll note that your comment sort of is saying that is undesirable, but the federal poverty level does provide a standard sort of measure. I've seen a few different versions of a California specific poverty measure, so I'm not totally certain which one you're asking about. But I think it's certainly, it's an interesting question to pursue. But at this stage, we're relying on FPL.
There's a question about which metrics are being considered to measure success of the pilot program.
So as I mentioned, some of the metrics that are being considered are things like the disconnection rate, both for an individual customer, for communities with high disconnection rates, and as well as whether customers' bills or unpaid bills rather increase or decrease over the long term, does customer payment behavior, like do customers stay more current on their bills, or do they fall behind at a similar rate as before PIP? So those are some of the, and also as far as metrics go, energy use has definitely been identified as an area of potential concern. So those are some of the items that we're thinking about monitoring over the course of the pilot.
We have a speaker asking, will the proposed decision provide more information on how community choice aggregate customers can participate? Is there any insight you can provide on
that? All I can say is that the proposed decision will provide more information on that.
Thank you. What about the unpaid? What happens to the unpaid portion? In other words, the amount over the cap of a participant's bill.
So that amount will basically be considered the program's subsidy to that customer, and would be subject to some form of cost recovery, but I don't want to get into the specific details of how that cost recovery would work here, I think.
We have a comments saying make sure that there's ways to enroll in the program other than the internet. A lot of low-income clients don't necessarily have access.
I appreciate that comment. Thank you.
Question also about CCAs. Will small CCAs be eligible, or will PG&E be the primary participating agency? The IOU, I guess.
Yeah. Again, the CCA issue is a little bit complicated, and I think I want to wait for the actual proposed decision to come out. But finding ways to allow CCA customers to participate has been the subject of a lot of comments. So it's definitely front of mind.
More of a comment about the federal poverty level again. The California Tax Credit Allocation Committee uses county median income levels to ensure that eligibility is based on the reality of what people earn in each county. We have a question about, has the revenue stream been identified to fund these programs? There's concerns that shifting to the kilowatt per hour price is a concern when PG&E and other IOU bills are already so much larger than much of the rest of the nation.
I appreciate that comment, and certainly, given the subject of our event today, affordability and high bills, certainly it's an important thing to keep in mind is that as we're creating these assistance programs, we're not creating the conditions for them as well. As I said earlier, I don't really want to get into the details of cost recovery at this stage, but I appreciate that comment.
Question on an acronym. Can you remind us what PIPP stands for?
Of course. PIPP is the Percentage of Income-Based Payment Plan. So it's basically an alternative mechanism for assessing customer bills that's based on the customer's income rather than their usage.
And I believe we are actually caught up.
Awesome. Thank you very much, John and Ben. If people have further questions about this, feel free to put them in the chat. We will have more time towards the end for some Q&A. And with that, we will hand the floor over to Jefferson. Jefferson?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for attending this morning. And thanks, Ben, for the previous presentation. This morning, I'll be talking about the affordability proceeding and specifically the framework that we've developed to measure affordability as part of that proceeding. This proceeding is kind of important in that it's the first real systematic look that the Commission has taken at the affordability of all its services together. Here at the Commission, we, admittedly are often, can get siloed into just energy, just water, just communications. So this has really been kind of a comprehensive look at assessing the affordability of all four of these services throughout the state. Obviously, affordability is a complex issue, so we've developed kind of a suite of metrics three of them that we use to assess affordability for all of these industries. And I guess onto the next slide, I'll start talking about what those are. By way of kind of an introduction or background on the proceeding itself, this framework has been under development for some time, starting with an initial workshop in early 2019, and the Commission formally adopting these metrics in June of 2020. As part of the decision, with the number listed here, that adopted those metrics, it also directed staff on the affordability proceeding to develop an annual report where we essentially use those metrics to measure the affordability of service across the state. So I'll be discussing some of those results briefly a little bit later, once I've kind of explained what the metrics are, how they work, how we use them. And so, a big part of that is really developing this concept of affordability as kind of a common language, these metrics to systematize the way that we talk about affordability, rather than just in terms of a bill increase or a specific, Ben hinted at the numbers of different California poverty level measurements that there are. So we're really intending for these affordability metrics to be kind of the baseline by which we kind of look at these kinds of issues. And so to that end, we're proposing, or we'll be putting out a staff proposal in early October of this year, accompanied by a workshop where we kind of discuss how these metrics can come into play in Commission's practice and kind of get to that point of, transitioning from just a measurement to actual action and policy. And so with the next slide, I will start talking about the framework itself. The decision I referenced in the previous slide adopted this definition of affordability, which has a couple kind of key components I wanted to touch on. The first is this concept that we're defining affordability as a degree, right? We're not at this stage saying that there is a level which is affordable and a level which is not. We're really looking at kind of the whole spectrum of, what does affordability look like geographically or over time. And we may be developing some benchmarks to kind of figure out what that means, but fundamentally, we're looking at affordability in kind of this relative scale. The second part I wanted to mention is that we are not looking at kind of personalized affordability numbers for kind of every household, right? We're looking at kind of geographic and temporal averages. We're looking at this idea of a representative household where, a typical consumer in a typical area can kind of give us a broader picture of what affordability looks like for someone in that situation. So, we're not necessarily intending to capture all the different variation in circumstances. We understand that there is a lot of variation out there. And so we're really just trying to get a general sense of what does affordability look like, for, again, this idea of a representative household.
Hi, Carlo.
The definition has kind of
two.
two.
Are you on the DER action plan?
Can I remind everyone to please mute themselves?
Okay, no, I'm in the
Continuing on, the definition has kind of two key components by which we're looking at affordability, which are the actual cost of service to that consumer, the consumer's bill that they would have to pay, as well as the ability to pay for that service. So this kind of affordability through these two lenses. And then the last component is this idea of essential service, where for each industry we've kind of defined a specific quantity of service that really needs to be affordable. And that's where our analysis is kind of focused. So those specific quantities are listed on the slide here. In the case of water, that represents basically the essential indoor usage, kind of consistent with the state water board's definition. For energy in both electricity and gas, we're looking at that tier 1 usage, or the baseline allowance. And then for communications, we adopt essential usage quantities for both broadband and voice. For voice, that's basic service. And for broadband, we have 25 Mbps down, 3 up. And so that's just kind of the quantities that we're looking at. So something to keep in mind We're not looking at really average usages or the whole distribution of what usage looks like across the state for the most part. We're really focusing in on these essential quantities. And next slide. So the first of the metrics that we're using to measure affordability in this way is the hours at minimum wage. And what this metric basically is for each industry, we take that essential service bill, how much is someone paying for 6 CCF of water, 600 cubic feet of water, and then we divide that by what the minimum wage is in the area in question. So it just represents kind of at the most basic, how long does someone have to work to pay for essential service? So it's kind of especially important in that it does track directly with the bill. It focuses on kind of low income earners, regardless of the geography that they're in as a whole. Focusing on even folks in high income areas, can still be working at minimum wage, and kind of we need to consider the affordability impact of that. And then it's also just kind of an intuitive metric, right? It's how long do you have to work is something kind of tangible and intuitive in a way that affordability isn't always. Next slide. And so the second metric is the Socioeconomic Vulnerability Index, or SEVI, where the previous metric, HM, or hours at minimum wage, basically focused on the bill itself. This one looks at kind of the other side of the equation. How able is the customer to pay for that bill? And so this one is defined at the census tract level, so it is more of a community scale indicator of affordability. It's based on the CalEnviroScreen framework developed by the OEHA, the Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessments, our sister agency. But it takes kind of a subset of that, where CalEnviroScreen looks at kind of pollution and other indicators that are not directly related to affordability. We're honing in on the socioeconomic components of that, specifically these 5: poverty, unemployment, education, housing burden, and linguistic isolation. So what that comes out to is identifying communities that are the least able to afford increases in those essential service bills. So how vulnerable is a community to if bills go up, and kind of looking in that holistic sense, how able is a community to pay for its essential services. I will note that this metric does not look at utility rates directly, and instead just looks at kind of the community scale. These 5 indicators kind of combined into a 0 to 100 index. Next slide. And so the third metric, this is kind of our keystone metric, is the affordability ratio. And I call it the keystone metric because it does look at both sides of that equation, right? The cost of service to the consumer, as well as the ability to pay for that service. And essentially, it represents the amount of money in a customer's wallet that they have to pay for service after other essential needs are accounted for. And so we can calculate affordability ratio for just one service or a bundle of them. So you can have an affordability ratio just for electricity, just for water, or for the whole kind of suite of 4 utilities or 4 services. And the way it's calculated is taking that bill for essential service and dividing it by the household income for that representative household, subtracting housing costs and the costs of the other services. So if we were calculating an essential service bill or an affordability ratio for electricity, we would use the electric bill in the top of the fraction, and then in the bottom we'd have the household income, subtracting housing costs along with water, gas, and communications. So what this is intended to do is to really look at the household's budget. We use the affordability ratio to look at kind of different geographies as well. We look at kind of, in the case of energy, we look at climate zone. For water, we look at water system. And this is just as a metric designed to give the broadest picture of what really is affordability. You know, we have it supported by HM and SEVI, these other two metrics, but this is the one that kind of you know, really defines what affordability means. And so go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit more about the details of the affordability ratio. So when we talk about that household income, we can calculate this affordability ratio for really any kind of income in question. We specifically are looking at, you know, in our analysis, a couple different income bands. One is the median income. What does affordability look like for kind of the average consumer? And then the 20th percentile income. On the lower end, kind of at the traditional boundary between, you know, the working and middle class, designed to target folks who might be right above that federal poverty level for assistance programs, but would still have affordability concerns. And so we get those incomes from basically US Census data. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about kind of our data sources and things like that. But we, you know, are focusing on a couple important points in the income distribution. And based on that, you know, I mentioned housing costs as our main indicator of, you know, other budget constraints, other household expenses. And the way that we are calculating those is as a function of income. So basically for a given income like the median, we are basically predicting for a given area what that housing cost might be. And, you know, the relationship that we found is that those costs do increase proportionally with household income. But as you get to the higher incomes, that rate of increase kind of tapers off. And so the kind of framework that we've developed to measure affordability and kind of predict these housing costs takes that into account. I would call back to that definition of representative household once more. I want to emphasize that, again, we're not creating kind of personalized affordability metrics for every household, but for a specific area, we're interested in kind of getting a broad sense of what do those housing costs look like relative to income, and how does that kind of, how is that interrelated with what we see in essential utility bills? And so kind of the way we calculate this is basically at a very geographically small area. We kind of take maps of all of our four types of services, water, electricity, gas, and communications. We overlay those with basically census tracts to get kind of a very geographically small area. We calculate affordability for each of those areas, and then we kind of build up to those are our building blocks that we use to go up to a kind of a more useful level. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about that. You know, as I mentioned, we start with this kind of very small area and build up. That's kind of to account for the different needs of affordability metrics for each of the industries, right? For energy, we're primarily looking at climate zone. Those are the areas that kind of rates are made at. For water, for example, service territories are generally much smaller than a climate zone, so we look at that like a whole service territory or rate making area specifically. We also use census geography, both in terms of where we get our data and how we present it. That income and housing data that I mentioned, we derive from something called the Public Use Microdata Sample, or PUMS. Those are reported at these areas called PUMA, which is kind of an important concept for us. That's the geography that's shown on the map on the right. There are 265 of them in the state, and they're each tied to about 100,000 people, if I'm not mistaken. And so what that means is basically an area that we can get basically very specific income and housing data on, that's small enough to give us a good picture of affordability for a specific region, but you know, is big enough that we don't run into any kind of confidentiality issues or anything like that. It's especially key for talking about affordability of communication services. You know, unlike energy or water, communications providers are non-exclusive in a given area. There can be kind of a number of different providers operating. And so the PUMA has been useful as the scale to which we kind of normalize all our affordability measurements for communication. So we report that data at the PUMA scale rather than at the scale of a specific utility or a specific climate zone, something like that. In addition, for energy, where those climate zones can be, large relative to, the area of the state, in some cases we break down that reporting for each climate zone by this PUMA. So just to get a little bit more granular, a little bit more specific as to the areas that we're looking at, and look at how affordability can vary within a specific climate zone. Next slide. And so just by way of, I won't spend too much time here, but kind of talking about where we get all of our data to calculate this. In terms of getting our actual bills, those are mostly coming from our regulated utilities directly. In the case of the small water utilities, we get those from tariffs. We also use data from the State Water Board to kind of support those efforts. But this is mostly here as a reference for folks to kind of follow up on, our data after this presentation or going forward. Next slide. And so with that kind of, high level view of the framework of the metrics that we're using, I'll take a minute to discuss, what we've seen in the observed data. What are the findings from our most recent annual report? And broadly speaking, what we see is, as you might expect, huge disparities in affordability across the state. That has both a geographic component, where certain areas of the state face greater burdens to affording essential services than others. But we also see kind of, even in the same areas, a big disparity where folks with the highest affordability concerns, those concerns are kind of very disproportionate to what we might expect. Income is a huge driver of this. But one of our expectations going into this report was that, areas with low incomes, the affordability concerns might be offset by lower housing costs as well. But we found that that's, for the most part, not the case. The cost of service plays a role, but income is a huge determiner of what we see in terms of affordability outcomes. And so in the next couple slides, I'll start discussing the industry-specific results and, getting into a little bit more detail on the next slide. So when we look at energy, this is kind of a big picture of what we see. On the left, we've identified some of the most vulnerable areas in terms of both that affordability ratio metric. As we can see, the most vulnerable areas tend to be in the Central Valley. We do see a high level of essential usage here due to primarily air conditioning, basically a higher baseline for these climate zones, as well as very low incomes. As I hinted at on the last slide, the lower housing costs in these areas are not usually enough to offset the lower incomes. And then on the right, what we see is kind of the distribution of electric AR20 values for the whole state. As I mentioned before, we are measuring these at climate zone and then kind of dividing those climate zones up into these smaller areas based on PUMA. And so this really highlights kind of the disparity between the high AR20 areas and the low AR20 areas, where we see a comparatively small percentage of households have affordability concerns that are just way outsized the rest of the distribution, it being kind of mostly a straight line up until you get to that last 10 or 15% where it just kind of skyrockets. And for the commission, this is kind of important to note. This really helps us kind of target our efforts for things going forward. But what we'll see on the next slide as we get into the other industries is that that pattern really kind of is common to all the industries. Both in terms of geography, we see a lot of the same areas popping up on the map on the left in the Central Valley, as well as farther south in Imperial County and Los Angeles. And then on the right, a similar type of distribution, right? Where for the broad spectrum of the distribution, affordability concerns are not that pronounced, but for the segment of households for whom it is pronounced, we just see, disproportionately high affordability numbers. In terms of gas, I think the causes for this are similar to what we see in electricity, where it's this kind of combination of low incomes and areas where that essential service bill ends up being extra high as a result of the high heating loads. Overall, there is less disparity in gas outcomes than there is for electricity, but we do have the addition of parts of LA County, which on the electricity side are largely not CPUC jurisdictional. So we are just primarily looking at our commission regulated utilities here. So next slide. And on water, I presented this a little bit differently, just to kind of highlight some of the differences that we see across industries and some of the differing causes. The one thing that is common to kind of all the numbers that I presented here, which are affordability ratios for the 20th percentile and median incomes on the left, and then the hours at minimum wage metric. These are kind of the top 5 of each category that we see. And what is kind of common to all these is something that I think we at the Commission are acutely aware of, which is that our small water utilities kind of bear the brunt of these affordability concerns. We see something very similar to energy, which is that there's kind of this double burden of high costs of service to the customer combined with low income in a lot of cases. And what using kind of the suite of metrics here can do is help us pinpoint what those causes are. So just kind of taking an example from the list on the bottom left, we see kind of 2 water companies that have almost the same AR50, the Sea Ranch Water Company and the California Pines District. But in terms of what those median incomes are, one has basically over twice the median income as the other, indicating that, especially when we see that service territory on the list on the right, the hours of minimum wage, we really do have a sense that in this case, it's primarily due to, high bills as a result of the cost of service. For small water utilities, there's usually less of a customer base over which to spread those costs of service. Often in rural areas, those costs to the utility will be higher just to begin with. And so, we can use these metrics to kind of pinpoint where our most vulnerable systems are. In particular for AR20, for folks with kind of the greatest affordability concerns, the income issue is just that much more pronounced. When we get into median incomes, the high rates come into play, but what we've seen is that a lot of these affordability concerns, both in water and kind of across the other industries, are really systemic. We see a lot of overlap with where our water utilities are in the same areas of electric and gas. And these tend to be the areas with the lowest incomes, both kind of in rural areas like the Central Valley, as well as in urban areas where we see kind of an even greater disparity. And I'll talk about that more on the next slide. In the context of communications, where this is, as I mentioned earlier, we report these communications numbers by PUMA. And so the second column on here kind of gives an example of the types of areas that a PUMA is looking at. And for the top 5, these are all in kind of basically low income areas in Los Angeles County. For communications in particular, where the provision of service is not exclusive, we see that, income is a huge driver here. It is not entirely, this is the top 5, but when we expand the list out to kind of the top 10% of vulnerable areas, it really is kind of not localized. It is all over the state. Number 7 is the south of Market and Potrero, PUMA, located here in San Francisco. But the rest of the top 10% is spread out kind of across the entire state. Butte County, Sacramento County, Fresno, Kern, Riverside, really a lot of the same areas that we've identified in the electricity and gas affordability analysis. So The other issue with communications that we see is the issue of accessibility. We've defined that essential service quantity as 25 Mbps down, 3 up. But a lot of the areas that we've analyzed, aren't even at the point of offering that level of service. And so a lot of, in those types of areas, we've incorporated services as low as 10 Mbps down. In some tribal areas and other disadvantaged communities, there's no service greater than 3 Mbps. So that's quite a bit less than the essential service we've identified. And so that's something to look at in conjunction with affordability. It's how affordable is the service if you're not even getting that kind of minimum quantity that we've identified. And so just kind of as a broader takeaway, the things that we see in affordability across industries are kind of common, where it's this overlap of high bills to customers for essential service with low incomes. And what our framework has been able to do really is identify those commonalities across industries and kind of point the commission in a direction to consider affordability in this holistic way across all 4 services in a way that it has not really done before. I think the results of our kind of first annual report show that, and we're looking forward to kind of doing further work and seeing how that progresses. So with the next slide, this will be the last one where I've listed some useful resources, our affordability webpage, as well as where you can find the details of that affordability report, as well as additional details on how we calculate these metrics. I kind of glossed over it, but the calculation, can be pretty intensive. So I'm happy to kind of, summarize what the steps we take are to kind of get into that, as well as we've made that information public to all of you. So I think now is the right time if there's any questions.
All right, thank you, Jefferson. John, can we any questions?
Yeah, mostly comments at this point, but there are a few questions. A lot about the federal income being a bad metric. Couldn't the percentage be increased, particularly for California? There's several questions about climate in the San Joaquin Valley. We strongly encourage and support regional evaluations when determining Tier 1 affordable rates. I believe, Jefferson, you talked a little bit about that after that question came in.
Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit more about that, either the federal versus California or climate zones, Jefferson?
Sure. I think that, the discussion of the federal poverty levels is especially significant here, which is mostly in the context of, in developing this framework, we found the federal poverty levels to be inadequate in a lot of cases as well. That's part of why when we are looking at income, we are really looking at very regionally specific incomes. From that public use microdata sample, we basically come up with averages for each of those PUMAs. And so, that can be as specific as I alluded to on the communications slide, a district of Los Angeles, such as, East Central City and Boyle Heights, or in cases where population is not as dense, it can cover a number of counties. Like I believe there are a couple counties in the north part of the state, Siskiyou, Shasta, Trinity, that are grouped into a single PUMA. And so we are looking at what the actual regional variation of income is, and then looking at using that same set of data to predict housing costs related to that.
There's a comment that HUD has excellent income data and charts for every county in the state, and it's a more concrete method for determining the ranges of income by county than the federal poverty line. Note on heating degree days and cooling degree days are good factors to consider. It's being used for federal and state LIHEAP allocations to ensure equitable distribution. There is a question about, do these housing costs that are considered accommodate housing subsidies such as vouchers? In other words, what they customers might actually pay for
housing? They do not. So what we do look at as far as housing goes is we are looking at observed data in terms of what folks report to the Census Bureau. What the public use microdata sample offers is basically household level, basically reporting of income and housing. So a given household will report, say, the number of people in their household, what their reported income is, and what their reported costs for either rent or mortgage are. And so that data that is reported in this public use microdata sample to the Census Bureau is what we're looking at. So I don't believe that normally considers vouchers, but we I think kind of our big lift here, I guess, has been translating that household level data into kind of a relationship based on income that we can use to predict what housing costs are for kind of any income level. So as I hinted at the beginning, there's a huge amount of variation in housing costs. We do acknowledge that that is partially the reality in California, where the housing costs are just hugely disparate. We've done a little bit to kind of ameliorate that concern by focusing on specific geographic areas. But yeah, I mean, even within an area, there's just a huge amount of variation in housing. We're focusing on this kind of typical or representative household idea where for a given area, we are hoping to get a general sense of the relationship between income and housing. But yeah, I definitely do acknowledge the number of other good data sources for housing costs that can be used kind of in parallel with this to kind of get a better sense of how closely we're fitting to the data.
The next question actually goes off of the income question. HM is a great addition to the suite of metrics. Centering labor seems to be uncommon when identifying types of metrics. Do you think we can use this metric across proceedings? And could you remind everyone what HM is? Hours at?
Yeah, HM is the hours at minimum wage, which is kind of a direct relationship dividing the essential service bill by the local minimum wage for that area. I am going to punt that question of how can we use this metric into proceedings to Ankit, because that is going to be the topic of his presentation coming up. So we're definitely interested in discussing that and getting feedback on that. But I think Ankit will take some time to outline what we're envisioning so far, and ask the question for what else we can solicit more suggestions for what else we can be doing.
To help us understand the depth of disparity for the AR, for the disadvantage, what is the range of the AR for middle incomes and high incomes?
That's a good question. So for the 20th percentile income, we do see, and it might be worth it to jump back a couple slides to the electricity summary, but we do see ARs basically all the way from 0 to 100. It's a little bit different for each industry. What we found is that the range of values is kind of all encompassing. So looking a little bit more closely at how that range is expressed. So for example, we have ARs ranging all the way from 0 to 100, but 85% of those are at an AR 20 of say 10 or 15% or below. So what we're really focusing our attention on is this 10 or 15% of households with those highest ARs, because those do really range all the way from 20% all the way up to 100%. It's kind of the those disproportionate affordability concerns.
Next question was, is any of this data paired with any qualitative data? Often the data is incomplete or wrong for the Central Valley.
That is a good point. So the data sources that we have used are outlined on one of these slides for folks to reference. We aren't using a lot of qualitative data in conjunction with these. I think we can welcome ways in which the qualitative data can support this, or call attention to areas that we might overlook. I think that's a great use for these metrics. But yeah, as of now, we have not used any qualitative data in conjunction with these.
Thank you. And the last question was suggested to look at the San Joaquin Valley proceeding as an example. And we are caught up with the questions.
It's good. If I could pose a quick question to make sure I'm understanding fully, Jefferson. So in terms of the AR, when we're talking at an AR about 100, to some degree, we're talking probably primarily their housing costs are so high that really the utility bills are a problem, but they wouldn't, they're basically life is completely, is completely unaffordable because of housing costs, and the utility costs are probably part of the problem, but then food and everything else is just an issue just because housing costs are just going to eat up basically their entire budget.
That's right. A lot of the, across all industries, a lot of the areas with the most pronounced affordability concerns, like ARs close to or at 100, are due to any utility bill, any bill for essential service is kind of hard to handle when there's that little of a budget left over. In some cases, what we see are areas where the housing costs and utility bills actually exceed the household incomes. Those are counted as 100% here. Because when you get to that AR 20 or that AR of 100%, it really does mean the same thing, which is that there is just not enough money in the budget to support the essential needs. But yeah, that's absolutely right. It's oftentimes due less to housing costs than the income to begin with. The incomes tend to be so low in those areas that in the same way, kind of regardless of what housing costs are, it's hard to find any kind of wiggle room in that budget. But yeah, a lot of the kind of most severe AR 20s are kind of at that level where affordability or unaffordability is really a systemic issue.
Are there any discussions with other agencies? Because to some degree, it strikes me that this data is relevant in terms of for community-based organizations and other agencies. In terms of these, probably the crisis is so bad for these families that that utility bills is at best, won't even at best a band-aid, but there really probably more comprehensive solutions are needed, such as bringing down housing costs and bringing down perhaps transportation costs and the like.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have done our best to make all this data available for other folks to use. I know we're very interested in kind of discussing more about now that we've taken these measurements, kind of what do we do with them. That'll be kind of the primary topic of our staff proposal coming out in early October. But at the end of the day, that will still be primarily restricted to what can the commission do, right? When, as you've noted, these issues are not necessarily due to utility bills at the end of the day. Utility costs, of course, play a role, and it is incumbent on the commission to do what we can about that. But yeah, absolutely. I think one good conclusion is that broader solutions are very much needed.
Okay, well, that's good. So we're going to have some more questions. We can get more to this topic and deal with more some more questions and open discussion later. I'd like to move on to Ankit so we can have his presentation and get the final piece. I think to some degree these sort of more open framework questions are good to deal with under the rubric of his discussion. Ankit, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. And so what I'm going to be covering, Jefferson kind of talked about what we did in phase 1 of this affordability OIR, where we were developing the framework and the metrics to measure affordability. What I'm going to be talking about primarily today is the work that we're undertaking as part of phase 2 of this proceeding, where we're trying to figure out what's the best way to take these metrics and incorporate them into the CPUC's decision-making, as well as making this data available to the public for other purposes outside of the CPUC's business. So if we go to the next slide. Before we start talking about how we are planning on using these metrics in the CPUC's decision-making, I want to just do a very quick review of the metrics in the context of what each of the metrics are, what the relative strengths are, just because that's going to have implications for the best way that these metrics can be put to use. So looking at the top row, the affordability ratio, as Jefferson explained, this is essentially the percentage of kind of the household's discretionary budget. So their budget, their income after you've accounted for housing costs and other utility services, that's available to pay for an essential level of the utility service that's in question. The kind of key strengths of this metric is that it can be used to look at affordability for households at different income levels in different parts of the state. It is fairly geographically granular. And I say fairly geographically granular because the data sets that we rely on, particularly for the incomes and housing costs, those are at that PUMA level, those 265 areas that encompass the state of California. So we can get down to some pretty granular geographic data. However, compared to the Socioeconomic Vulnerability Index, that other metric that Jefferson mentioned, that metric can get down to the census tract level, which is a more granular level, a finer level of geographic granularity than the PUMA. So it can get you some pretty detailed information, but not as detailed as the SEVI metric. And I think kind of the key strength of the affordability ratio metric is because it's an estimate for a representative household based on a set of data sets that we have, we can actually build some assumptions about what future values would be for those inputs, and we can therefore forecast what future values of the affordability ratio would be based on a set of assumptions. So weaknesses, like I mentioned, it's not as granular as the SEVI metric. Also, it is looking at affordability for a representative household, so it might not capture all of the individual circumstances of any given household. And we are looking at essential usage rather than actual usage data. The hours at minimum wage metric, as Jeff mentioned, it's the number of hours needed to work at the minimum wage for a given area to pay for an essential level of utility service. This metric's very easy to understand. It's easy to convey, and it also really captures what affordability looks like for low-income households, regardless of what the wealth of the community as a whole looks like. So it really does focus in on the most vulnerable members of the community, regardless of the affluence of that community. However, it doesn't account for other household expenses, and often what we see is that the range of outcomes that we're seeing for the HM metric mostly reflect differences in essential usage levels from one part of the state versus the other. We mentioned that there's considerable differences in an essential level of electricity usage that's defined by the climate zone. So your essential level of usage in the Central Valley is going to be very different from what you see on the coast, for example. And then the SEVI metric, as we discussed, it's kind of an index of a couple of different elements that speak to affordability at the community scale and allows us to have that comparison between different parts of the state. But because it is derived from the CalEnviroscreen metric, we don't really have any way of forecasting what the metric is going to look like in future years, which I think is kind of the main limitation, even though it really does allow us to understand affordability at a very, very detailed level geographically. So if we go to the next slide, kind of keeping in keeping this context in mind, we can start thinking about what is the best way to take these metrics and put them to use in the context of CPUC decision making. As Jeff mentioned, part of the phase 2 work, we're aiming to have a staff proposal that speaks to this issue by October. And kind of the two main topics that we're planning on covering in that staff proposal are the upcoming affordability calculator that we're developing as part of this phase of the proceeding. This is a tool that we are planning on making publicly available that will allow parties to a proceeding, or the public in general really, to calculate what future values of the AR and potentially also the HM metric will look like in future years based on our current understanding of socioeconomic trends at a regional level across the state, as well as user-defined inputs for what an essential usage bill would look like in the future for different parts of the state. So alongside the staff proposal, we're hoping to issue that tool in October and then have a workshop to walk through how the tool works and gather feedback from parties on how to improve the tool. The other aspect that we're planning on covering as part of the staff proposal is kind of the meat of this phase of the proceeding, which is how do we take these metrics and put them into use in CPUC decision making. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the AR calculator before I get into kind of the potential applications that we're hoping to address in the staff proposal. So if we go to the next slide, I could talk a little bit more detail about the affordability metrics calculator. So the goal with this calculator, like I said, is to provide a publicly available tool that will allow for the calculation of primarily the AR metric, because it is a fairly complicated metric. It requires kind of input from multiple different data sources and analysis at very geographically granular levels before the results can be kind of summarized at more of an aggregate level and then and spit out by the tool. So rather than relying on parties to a proceeding or utilities to calculate these metrics, we wanted to make a tool available that would make it fairly standardized as to how the metrics would be calculated so that they can be included in the CPUC's decision making. The tool will rely on California Department of Finance forecasts for estimates of changes to income levels and housing costs. Those are kind of the two main inputs from a socioeconomic perspective that go into the AR metric. And the DOF forecasts allow for kind of regional differentiation in what economic outlook will be across the state, and allow us to understand what income level changes and housing costs will look like over time. We plan on refreshing this tool on an annual basis. That'll be a process that goes along with the preparation of our annual affordability report. The idea is that we'll update the tool with the most recent billing data, the most recent socioeconomic data from the Census Bureau, the most recent forecast data from the Department of Finance, and we'll make this tool available on the CPUC website annually so that it can be used in proceedings. And like I said, the main goal behind this tool is to allow users to input what their expectations are for essential usage bills in future years, and it'll spit back out what the affordability ratio would look like in future years. So we go to the next slide. I mentioned we have kind of two main use cases for how we think these metrics can help inform the CPUC's decision making. The first use case is kind of where that affordability calculator tool would come into play, which is to understand the affordability impacts associated with expected rate increases. So the example I have is, for instance, if an electric utility were to file a GRC application, a general rate case application, where they're requesting a rate increase based on their current and expected costs over the GRC period, the utility, what we're considering, including in our staff proposal, is requiring the utilities to include an estimate of the AR and HM metrics in their application by climate zone, by each of the climate zones that are in their service territory, so that we can understand what those metrics look like based on the current rates as well as the proposed rates, and understand what the affordability impact is as a result of the rate increase. Part of the idea for making the AR calculator tool publicly available is that parties to that proceeding would then also be able to look at alternative scenarios. So if the revenue request were to be changed as a result of certain costs being excluded, they would be able to estimate what the essential usage bill would look like as a result in that alternative scenario, and what the affordability impact would look like. And that way, the CPUC can understand quantitatively and objectively what are the affordability implications of different rate increase levels in the future. The second use case that we are considering in our staff proposal is kind of the use of relative values of the metric, comparison between different parts of the state to allow for prioritization of resources. So this could be targeting marketing and outreach efforts for assistance programs, prioritization of benefits, determination of eligibility for enhanced benefits. Kind of the example I have for this scenario is I'm looking at the Energy Savings Assistance Program, which is a program that allows for low-income households who qualify to have energy efficiency upgrades for their households at no cost to them. And part of the element that's currently being considered for that program is for certain households allowing kind of a deeper level of energy efficiency benefits, so expanded program benefits for households that qualify. And even though individual households would need to qualify based on income levels in order to participate in the program, we're thinking one way we could apply these metrics is to identify priority communities where we want to have enhanced benefits, those deeper levels of energy efficiency upgrades. And we could use that prioritization based on the results of, for instance, the AR and the SEVI metrics to identify communities that are particularly vulnerable and would be particularly vulnerable to future increases in rates. So like I said, these are kind of straw proposals. Nothing has been finalized. These are what we're considering putting into our proposal as we go about developing it, moving closer to that October target date for the staff proposal. But we would like to get input from folks on what they think about how we plan on using these metrics in the context of CPUC proceedings. On the next slide, I've got kind of a list of questions that we have for folks who are participating today about how these metrics could be used in CPUC decision-making. Obviously, welcoming comments in the chat at the current time, but if there are thoughts that anyone develops later, or kind of a deeper discussion or extended comments that want to be submitted, my contact information is available at the end of this presentation, as well as Jeff and Ben's. So I encourage you to send us an email and provide feedback that way as well. Just at a high level, the questions I've got here are, we're seeking feedback on additional ways that metrics can be used within the CPUC's decision-making. What are some of the limitations that we should be keeping in mind when leveraging these metrics? Are there ways that the metrics can be improved, additional elements that can be included? Are there other ways that we can contextualize these metrics? Primarily at the current time, we're thinking about using them to understand affordability for one community relative to other parts of the state, but are there other ways to kind of correlate these measurements to other empirical measures of hardship that would allow us to more definitively identify what is and is not affordable in an absolute sense? And then if you go to the next slide, just some more general questions outside of just how we plan on using these metrics in the context of the CPUC. Interested in understanding whether these metrics are useful in any context outside of the CPUC's functions. And if so, how can these results be reported in such a way that would be useful? Jefferson's kind of gone over a couple of map-based presentations of the metric outputs. We've also issued a written report back in April that looked at the state of affordability, utility affordability in California based on 2019 data, so pre-pandemic. And then we've also made these results available in Excel-based outputs, and we're wondering is that something that you would find useful? And also thinking along those lines is what level of geographic granularity would be most useful if you were to leverage these metrics in any context outside of what the CPUC's work is. And then are there similar metrics that you use that are useful, and is there any kind of any limitations that they have, any overlap that you see between those metrics and these ones, and ways that these metrics can be used in those other contexts as well? So with that, I'm going to stop and open it up to questions.
Thank you, Ankit. A couple questions have come in. One was, how will you take into account that a change in cost is not directly correlated with a change in rates?
Let me make sure I understand that. A change in cost to the representative household that we're considering? I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
I can figure out when it came in so I can figure out what you were talking about at that time.
Okay. I think I need a little bit more clarity as to what is the, I think maybe the question is asking whether a change in rates might not be necessarily due to a change in utility costs. So there might be other drivers for rate increases as part of the GRC process, maybe. If that is what the question is asking, I would say that we are not really trying to understand the root cause of the rate increase in the context of how these metrics are being used. We're trying to understand what the impact is going to be to households, and particularly vulnerable households. So really, we're just trying to understand and measure what the affordability impacts are, rather than dig into how do we mitigate the cost increases that are or other factors that are necessitating the rate increase. Hopefully that answers the question, and if not, please follow up with a clarification.
The next one is more of a comment. They appreciate us being so transparent in explaining the metrics to include the weaknesses. It does reaffirm their concern that the hot climate areas remain at risk, reaffirming the need to take cost and charges off bill and off the kilowatt per hour price that do not include the actual cost to deliver service. Failure to do so will continue the practice of having hot climate customers shoulder more of the burden.
Yeah, definitely something that we are very aware of. Like I said, we are defining essential levels of particularly electricity usage based on the climate zone, in recognition of the fact that there are very different energy needs for some parts of the state compared to others. I will also say that we are closely tied into the ongoing essential usage study that is part of the PG&E GRC proceeding. In that proceeding, they are collecting residential appliance saturation survey data, as well as qualitative interviews with customers to understand what their electricity needs really are, whether the essential usage levels, the baseline allowances are kind of are determined correctly, whether they accurately reflect what the actual essential usage needs are for customers, particularly in these hotter climate zones. So even though in this proceeding we are currently tying essential usage levels on the energy side to the baseline allowances, that's something that we do plan on revisiting once we get more information from this essential usage study. And I'm particularly interested to hear what comes out of those qualitative studies to understand how customers, particularly low-income customers, are dealing with some of these affordability challenges, how they respond to situations where, you know, maybe they need electricity to power an air conditioner, but they just don't want to, or they're not going to be able to handle those higher bills in those summer months. How are they responding to that? And is that something that we can capture more accurately within the context of our metrics? So I appreciate the comment. Yes, very much.
We did have a follow-up clarification from the previous question's original asker. They said, you seem to indicate that the public would be able to understand how a changing cost of service might affect affordability in the future, but perhaps they misunderstood.
Right. Okay, so the idea is that with the affordability calculator that we are planning on making available, anyone would be able to understand how those metrics will change in future years in response to an increase or a change in the essential usage bills. So, you know, it might not be the case that any random member of the public would be kind of taking this tool and using it to generate the affordability metrics. It might be more that parties to a proceeding, so for instance, consumer advocacy group, would be using the tool to understand the affordability implications associated with a proposed rate from that the IOU is including in their GRC application, and then also possibly looking at a counterfactual scenario or alternative scenario with a different funding level for the utility and therefore a different essential usage bill. How would the affordability metric look different in that scenario, and allow us to have kind of a very objective and quantitative comparison between different scenarios, so that within the context of the CPUC's decision making on an application, we'd be able to have a more, I guess, informed discussion about what the affordability implications are for different assumed essential usage bills in the future.
Next question is, sorry if they missed this, but has a definition been established for what is affordable for HM, SEVI, and AR20?
It has not, and I think that's a very important point to make. We are not, within the context of this proceeding at this time, defining any thresholds for affordability, and that's primarily due to the fact that, you know, these metrics are able to capture what affordability looks like for a representative household, but obviously individual circumstances are going to change quite a bit for any given household. So in order to define affordability without relying on some sort of rule of thumb that's kind of disconnected from actual lived experiences of anyone, we would need to be able to sort of take these metrics, tie them to some sort of empirical measure of hardship, and then based on an actual cutoff for that more empirical grounded measure of hardship, then tie that to our metrics. That's something that we haven't been able to do as part of this proceeding just yet. We think that the utility of these metrics primarily is going to be more in the context of understanding affordability for certain communities relative to other communities, being able to have that comparison across different parts of the state. But in terms of absolute definitions of affordability, that's not something that we've established as of yet.
Next question is, how confident are we in the data used for this tool, and how have any bias or data gaps been mitigated for?
Well, so the data sources that we're relying on, we feel are fairly reliable in terms of the accuracy. I mean, this is the income and housing cost data is coming from the U.S. Census Bureau from a sample that they collect annually. It's very well vetted. And we've been very careful to make sure that we're taking that data and not draw any inferences that we don't feel comfortable standing behind. So we are paying close attention to kind of what the statistical validity is of the data sets that we're relying on. On the billing side, we are requesting that data from the utilities themselves, at least on the energy side. Jefferson, you could talk in more detail, I'm sure, about the water billing data and the different sources that we're using there. In terms of how confident we are in terms of capturing what the data sets are not necessarily able to capture, that's something that I think that we'll we'll get more familiarity with as we make this data more available to the public, and we get feedback from the public in terms of how accurate they see these metrics and whether we're seeing any gaps. You know, one of the questions I posed in my previous slide was, do you see any potential limitations and opportunities for improvements to these metrics? We're eager to hear if there are suggestions for alternative or supplementary data sources that we can use to bolster these metrics as well. I don't know, Jeff, if you want to talk about the water utility bill data at all.
Yeah, so for the most part, especially for our commission regulated utilities, you know, that data is obtained directly from the utilities or, you know, from our tariff books on file. The one place where it gets a little bit trickier is, for example, if you want to calculate the energy AR in an area that is not served by a commission regulated water provider, because the commission regulated water providers serve a pretty small portion of the state geographically. In that case, we need to kind of impute some bill for, you know, what water service is in an area that we don't necessarily have that data on. So far, we've been getting that data from the state water board's electronic annual reports and kind of vetting and processing that. So, you know, that data is also pretty reliable. The electronic annual reports have some issues, but, you know, we kind of make sure to review that data before putting it into this calculator. Worth also noting that the section of the State Water Board's annual report that we primarily use has been made mandatory as of this year. So before it was, you know, voluntary, our data was a little spottier, but kind of going forward, we can expect much more reliability in data from municipal water providers as well. Though again, that's not our main area of focus. We're not actively calculating those AR or not actively presenting those ARs for areas other than commission regulated. It just kind of goes into the back end of the calculation when we, you know, want to consider that folks outside our regulated water utilities do in fact receive water service.
Last question so far is, tying assistance to income rather than usage is good. Would it be possible for the investor-owned utilities to provide LIHEAP providers a list of high utility users so they can be assisted?
So I'm not sure if I'm in a good spot to answer that question. I'm not as familiar with the data sharing requirements and limitations between IOUs and LIHEAP providers, and whether they're able to provide information on usage levels for specific customers. So I'm not sure if I can answer that question. Sorry.
And that's us caught up with all the questions, Chris.
Okay, thanks. I want to at this point, if we have some more open questions, because we've got yes, Leslie, I was going to get to you. Leslie's been very patient and has had her hand up for a while, so I want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Christopher. Thanks so much for all this. And thanks so much for the presentation. It was really informative. I just have a few points that I want to make. I'm with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. We're a CBO based in the San Joaquin Valley and the East Coachella Valleys. We work really closely on the San Joaquin Valley proceeding, as well as just other CPUC matters. And I just kind of want to talk about this in kind of like a bigger lens. The first comment that I have is that when we talk about this housing narrative about how like it's already unaffordable in a lot of these places, so like the utilities is kind of like another, you know, like a side piece, I guess. I just want to talk about how the qualitative data here is so important, because residents go through crazy lengths to ensure that they can pay their utility bills, because that depends on their kids going to school clean. That depends on, you know, there's just like a lot of other factors that go there for basic living needs. And in fact, a lot of people will borrow money from people in the community, and then when the late fees comes, it gets really complicated and extremely unaffordable for residents. So I wanted to highlight that. The other part I wanted to highlight is that a lot of the usage rates right now are for people who are living without AC, because AC is not required in the South yet in housing. Often no working AC, swamp coolers that are from like for me, I feel like they're like 100 years old. And then the other part of it is like heat, right? We have a lot of issues with folks using small heaters because they don't have good heating in their homes, or they're just like they live in mobile homes that are not weatherized as well. So I think that when we talk about affordability, we have to talk about it kind of in this really grounded way, where we talk about the real life experience of community members. And then the other part that I wanted to talk really quickly touch on was when we talk about minimum wage in the San Joaquin Valley, we have a lot of folks who are just not making even minimum wage. We're talking a lot about irregular work, whether that be renting bounce houses in the community, farm workers who get paid by boxes or how much they pick, and also seasonal workers. Not everybody has steady work throughout the year because of the manner of just like the economy here in the San Joaquin Valley, which is a comment that often comes up when we talk to a lot of folks about how affordability is hard for them to really talk about, because it depends on when, how the season is going, if there is a drought, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other part that I wanted to talk about is when we talk about like prioritizing where we put information. To me, when I hear that this tool is going to be used to make objective decisions, and I just want to make sure that it's also based in its ground. And although I trust that you are all working very hard and are much smarter than me when it comes to data and numbers, I really want to talk about how important it is when we say objectively, that it means grounded and rooted in the real reality of what it is to live in the San Joaquin Valley, in the East Coachella Valley, in places that have like extreme weather, and then what it really means to like what it means for them to have affordability. Because when we start to sway, when we kind of sway away from that, and we take this big lens of just data, there's holes in data in the San Joaquin Valley. We've seen it time and time again, and I really would emphasize the need to pair all of this with real life on the ground communities and to talk about their experiences, to make sure that if there's any way that we can. I know it's really hard for qualitative data. I know non-energy benefits are like a faux pas at the CPUC level, but I think that if we want to ensure that what this tool really works to what we're aiming for, right? Like I think we all have the same goal, and we want to ensure that like energy is affordable for folks. Then we have to talk to people. We have to know what they're doing. I think a good example is the San Joaquin Valley, the data gathering, where they're talking to community and pairing like this data with the experiences, because if this is going to be used to make objective decisions, I fear that for residents who this data may not match up for, we're still going to have unaffordable rates for the most vulnerable, right? So I know this may not be the space to have it, and I know this might be like a bigger conversation at the CPUC level, but I just wanted to make sure that is that you all hear that, and I welcome conversations with our staff to figure out if there's any type of way that we can incorporate some of this qualitative data in any way, or how it's helpful for us to gather it and send it over, just to ensure that we really come up with a product that really gets at what we're all trying to fix, right? So thank you so much, Christopher, for seeing my hand.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, thanks. No, I think that's I think that's exactly why we're having this discussion too. I think that brings up some tough questions. I wonder if Anki or Jefferson, would you want to talk about what your thoughts are about how this might be addressed in the framework of our decision making?
Yeah, sure. I can take that. Yeah, I fully appreciate the comment and the feedback on the need to tie these metrics to actual lived experiences. And again, I would say that we are paying close attention to the qualitative interviews that are going to come back from the essential usage study to see if that can help fine tune these metrics to make sure that they do accurately reflect what is actually happening on the ground. And generally, I would say that, at least for me, I don't envision these metrics as being something kind of set in stone and we define it and then we walk away and we hope that it accomplishes its goal. I think that it is going to be an ongoing iterative process of gathering feedback from the community, understanding if we are seeing systemic shortfalls in these metrics, if we're not capturing what is actually happening on the ground based on the data sets that we're relying on, and seeing if there's a way to fill that gap, if there's suggestions to improve these metrics. That's going to be an ongoing process as these metrics get rolled out, as members of the public, as consumer advocacy groups, as others get their hands on these metrics, get familiarity with them, start to understand what those results look like for their specific communities. And if they're seeing something that's just, systematically off from what they're seeing on the ground, we do welcome that feedback. And that's what part of this process is to gather that feedback.
Yeah, and if I could really quickly add to that, I appreciate that. And I think you're right. I think, part of making sure that this tool works is working together to ensure that, we update it, and make it adaptable. What I would encourage and recommend is that, rather than depending on community-based organizations that are shortly staffed, low capacity. I know everyone knows this, but I would recommend coming out to communities and showing the tool and getting direct feedback from community residents about what they think. Working with CBOs, in a way where you can all hear directly from them. I think folks are better at talking about their experiences. Putting kind of some of that work on the CPUC to seek information in a way that is acceptable for community, in their community, in the appropriate language, because getting to San Francisco from the San Joaquin Valley is not easy in terms of public transportation, et cetera. So yeah, I want to flag that as this goes on, there is a strong outreach plan and a way to incorporate community feedback, resident feedback for those who are most vulnerable, and ensure that it's just ongoing conversations. But thank you. I really appreciate y'all taking my questions. I know a lot of this is sometimes above what most folks can do, so I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Thank you, Leslie. I would just offer one thing, Anki, is that perhaps my unit could also be of use in terms of liaising with CBOs and councils, and maybe if we're in the process of a general rate case or something, we have the utilities coming out with this data, we can try to make sure that the word gets out and that people understand what's in there. And just, people have a lot going on. It's one thing to follow the proceeding and become part of the proceeding. It's another thing that this data is out there. There's going to be an opportunity for comment, and then, we can try to create forums and make people are aware of opportunities to comment on that data, which can be, they might be able to look at that data and relatively quickly say, there's some severe issues because of this and this and this, so we can help with that qualitative side.
Yeah, no, I really like that suggestion. I'm gonna take that back to our working group and figure out how we can best act on that suggestion.
Okay. Yeah, I also offered that maybe within the context of the ESJ action plan. So maybe with Monica Palmiera, there might be something to work on there as well.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Looks like okay. Thanks. It looks like some people would like to maybe look at some people want to look at your contact information on Keat. In terms of the process, do you want to go to the last slide here, Hope? Yeah, there we go. So in terms of the feedback, yeah, that's on Keat. Here are the names of all the speakers here and our contact information. So yeah, Anki specifically would be these larger framework questions would be the one to share that information with. It looks like those are all our questions. Anyone, we welcome you to follow up afterwards. The recordings will be made available, so feel free to rewatch as many times as you want. There are some good resources shared in there if you want to dig into this more. But if there aren't any more questions, then I'd like to, Asia, could you please drop the evaluation survey in the chat? Looks like Asia's having. Oh, there it is. Okay, so here's our survey for today's workshop, or webinar. So we really hope you'll just take it. It's very short, so we hope you'll take a few minutes to take it. Outreach and engagement is very important to the commission, and we're trying to create more opportunities and do them better. So I ask you please take a couple minutes to do that. Otherwise, I've seen some requests to get added to our list. Appreciate that. We maintain lists, especially our local government liaisons have lists of local entities. They try and notify of future opportunities. So we also have the ability to subscribe to various proceedings through our website. We hope you will stay engaged, and we hope to see you at future events. We're trying to hold these webinars quarterly at the very least. And of course, there's always a lot of events going on our website, which you can see through the daily calendar. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much to our panelists and all our support staff. Hope for flipping through the slides, and John and Asia for helping with the questions and logistics. It's great to have you all today, and I hope everyone has a nice Thursday and a wonderful weekend as well. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, Chris, do any of us want to stay on for a sec after everyone leaves?
I'll set up another meeting. We can have a quick recap meeting.
And nice job.
Thanks.
Good session.
Just staying on in case any comments come in.